Now, we're rather sticking to the sea and the oceans, the origin of all life on Earth, so listen to this. Doesn't that make you think of summer holidays? Makes you think of life, of course, as well. Now, sitting here in the studio is the main reason for today's oceanic theme. Diver, businessman and paleontologist Wolfgang Grulke, who has just published the most beautiful and very thought-provoking book entitled Beyond Extinction, The Eternal Ocean. Wolfgang, you're very welcome here. This really is. I've got this book in front of me. I wouldn't want to drop it on my toe. It's quite large and it's absolutely lovely. It's called The Eternal Ocean, Climate Change and the Continuity of Life, which sounds slightly controversial as a subtitle. Is it intended to be?
Well, I think you just have to look at the media today, and climate change, extinction are words that crop up all the time. And I think very often they're used without having a perspective on what it actually means. And the book really looks at the last 500 million years of the evolution of life and makes the point that without extinction, evolution doesn't happen.
You know, it's interesting because that is not an obvious thought, is it? We tend to think of extinction as the end, don't we?
Yeah, you know, to me, having spent so much time underwater, and you really get to think that this is the way it's always been. And the fact is that it has. If you dive on a coral reef or snorkel on a coral reef, whether it's in the Red Sea or in Australia or wherever, you may as well be diving on a Jurassic reef, because almost all of those animals on the reef were there more than 300 million years ago.
It's extraordinary, isn't it? I mean, one really doesn't think of it, that other word, continuity, which is in your subtitle. Don't tend to think of the continuity of life, do you? I mean, you call it oceans the womb of all life on Earth, and I suppose that womb gave birth to the very first life forms how many millions or billions of years ago?
Well, most people sort of know of the Cambrian explosion of life. You know, it's almost around 500 million years ago that life diversified into many of the animal groups that we know today. In fact, what we created for the book was a chart that takes all of the animal groups that are alive today and traces the history back to that moment in the Cambrian 500 million years ago. And the big surprise when you look at it from that perspective is how few animal groups have actually disappeared. You know, dinosaurs, for example, everybody knows are no longer here. But of course they are. Birds have evolved from dinosaurs, and it was only the biggest of the species that died out. Then the ammonites, of course, Dorset is full of ammonites, and they died out. And there are trilobites that died out. But in fact, very few of the major animal groups have died out. They all evolved into incredible new forms. But over that 500 million year period, every part of that evolution was dependent on something going extinct. Take us as an example. You know, humans would not be here today if dinosaurs had not gone extinct 66 million years ago. Because at that point, the largest mammal was the size of a shrew. The only reason mammals exploded were the fact that dinosaurs left a white space into which mammals could evolve.
Now, you use the term white space, and you say you use that in business as well. It just means an empty place a niche which something else can
That's right.
evolve to fill.
You know, nature's like that. If you clear an area of rainforest in the Amazon and you plant something else, you've annihilated something, but you've created space for something else that in this case humans really want. It may not be advisable. In fact, in many cases, it's quite stupid to do that. But, you know, we've never been known to be unselfish.
Well, I suppose like all species. I mean, it's Richard Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene. I suppose that was probably a big surprise to a lot of people, because that kind of made the point that everything is driven by selfish motives,
Exactly.
consciously or unconsciously.
Right down to a genetic level.
Yes, absolutely. Now, so we've established that extinctions are not the universal disaster that we believe them to be. Then, extinction can be a positive thing.
Well, they're a necessary and vital part of an evolutionary process. I think extinction becomes quite scary when it involves you, or potentially involves you. And I think that's, if you look at everything that we do as a human species, it is to make life more comfortable for ourselves. And in the process, we use resources that the earth has, whether it's water or iron ore or whatever. We build buildings, we make concrete and all of this stuff. All the time we're using up materials and energy, of course. And there's a kind of a dilemma in all of this. It's really because we are quite smart that we continually innovate. If we were really dumb and had no ambition and no kind of dreams for our children, this would all be very easy. We'd live in a stable society. We would not want for anything. But we know that the human spirit is not like that.
But there's always the element of competition, of course, as well, which sort of mitigates
that
against.
too. But even if there wasn't competition, because we are smart, we want to be creative, innovative. We want to do more different things. And then, of course, there's competition between countries, between companies, between individuals for the best jobs. And all of that involves growth. And, of course, the stark reality is that you cannot have infinite growth on a finite planet.
Well, I think it was David Attenborough who said, did he not, that anyone who believed in eternal expansion or perpetual expansion was either an economist or an idiot.
Or both.
Yes, or both, indeed, why not? One of the things I found really interesting in your book is that you point out there were 5 major cataclysmic events that sparked five mass extinctions, but that the worst of those wiped out, was it 96% of life in the oceans and 71% or 70% of life on land? How on earth did life manage to regroup and reform and continue after that?
The term mass extinction really means that the majority of animal species or plant species were exterminated by some cataclysmic events. And over the period, we've identified commonly 5 of those. And they're all big extinctions, and every time there was a hiatus, and very slowly the animals that did survive evolved into new species. So mammals, for example, after the extinction that killed the dinosaurs. But there was another extinction even before those 5 extinctions. You probably wonder where the atmosphere got all its oxygen from. And if you go back 3, 4, 5 billion years, oxygen was actually poisonous to everything that lived on Earth. The simple life forms that were around then. And over a period of about 3 billion years, algae in the water actually started pouring out oxygen. And in the process, they killed off every living thing on Earth. But of course, what they did do is create an atmosphere in which life forms like our own, complex life, could thrive. So there have been many of these. And once you step back and get that historic and prehistoric perspective, I think you can see how precious life is. And if you just look in your garden today, or look on a shore down in Dorset or Purbeck, or wherever you happen to be, the amount of life that is in any rock pool is quite astonishing. And one of the aspects of the book, and why I did this, was really that I've spent the last 30 years diving and taking photographs underwater. And it always amazes me that people don't really appreciate that the animals they're diving with have this long history. We somehow think that everything evolved quite recently. So it's a celebration of life, really, not just in the ocean, but everywhere. But with a perspective that says, hey, extinction may be necessary for a proper evolutionary process in the future too. And there is an argument by some people that we should let extinction happen. Of course, the moment that you suggest that we may be part of that, it starts becoming very tricky.
Yes.
But certainly, just one point I would say is that today probably the Homo sapiens is the single most endangered species on the planet.
Not endangering?
Well, endangering, but in the process of what we're doing, we will probably create an environment in which we can't survive. The planet will survive, but we won't. Now, the question is how long that might take. The current view is somewhere between 100 and 1,000 years before we make the planet uninhabitable for ourselves.
But sadly, of course, for pretty much everything else.
But as we've learnt in the past, life recovers, comes back.
I'm just going to bring you to a couple of to leave the sort of the big issues behind and come to a couple of the species that you illustrated. Well, first of all, there are the wonderful stromatolites. I mean, who doesn't remember those shots of David Attenborough standing in Shark Bay in Western Australia looking at these stromatolites, which looked like upended elephants' feet, didn't they?
That's right.
And these were some of the organisms that helped provide that oxygen and give birth to life on Earth.
For more than 2 billion years, these very simple structures created oxygen, slowly. And without them, we wouldn't have oxygen in an atmosphere we could live in.
That's really what you call the miracle of life, isn't it? Something like that.
Well, it's the fuel of life.
Yeah.
For us, oxygen is essential, and almost for everything on Earth, except some of the things that live in these deep sea vents.
Internal combustion engines too, of course.
Exactly, yeah.
You mentioned the fact that trilobites went extinct. Have you come across the Moreton Bay bugs of eastern of Australia that live on the rocks, and they look awfully like them?
Well, in fact, trilobites, you find a lot of them in Wales, for example, and they look like insects. And, some people call them the insects of the sea. But they died out not suddenly. In fact, they died out over a period of, probably 100 million years through several extinctions. But yes, they are. The insects today could easily be mistaken for a trilobite.
and the ones I really liked that really tickled my fancy were the moss piglets. I think you'll have to tell us what those are, moss piglets.
Well, the scary thing about them is that they are everywhere, wherever there's water. So if you've had salad for lunch today, you've probably eaten about 200 of these guys.
I had a
and
cucumber.
They're not pretty.
This is why we can't see them then, isn't it, without a microscope?
Exactly, but they can see us.
Now, on a more serious note here, getting away from moss piglets, Wolfgang, what if we humans kill much of oceanic life through our toxic chemical waste and our plastic waste, in particular the microplastics? What then?
Look, we have to go a long way to kill all of it. We will certainly make the environment poorer, but for us to kill all of it would be quite difficult. Let me give you an example. In the 60s, you remember the United States did some hydrogen bomb tests on an atoll in the Pacific Ocean, commonly known as the Bikini Atoll. Now, these were the biggest explosions ever released anywhere on the planet, really testing a device that has never been used, thank goodness. But what's interesting is that last year, Harvard University did an extensive study on the reefs there and found that life was absolutely thriving. So after almost 60 years, all of the reef life has adapted to living in what is still quite radioactive. So the corals are thriving in a radioactive environment. There's been new diversification. The fish and all the other reef animals are back. So I think that's an extreme example of what happens when we destroy something. And it also shows the resilience of nature and the amazing continuity of life. We are incredibly fragile. But nature itself is very difficult to kill en masse. We will destroy certain species by overfishing or eating too many shrimp or whatever it is. But to actually endanger the planet is quite difficult. Now, having said that, of course, the planet has gone through many of these sudden changes, and we still don't fully understand those. And they may be caused by us, without us even knowing about it, or by some outside event like a meteorite. And one of the scenarios that we've used in the past is, imagine we could get all the nations on Earth to really agree that we would contain growth, the use of resources, and everything would settle down in a stable state. And the next day, a small meteorite hits the Earth. So we have so little control, actually, over the big picture. We should never be stupid about anything that affects the unique cocoon that we live in. And whether it's throwing away plastic, using too much energy, or whatever, just being sensible actually gets around a lot of that. And the problem is that at a national level, there's still no single agreement on what the planet needs. 10 people can sit around a table somewhere on the planet and agree that, can't they?
You'd hope so, wouldn't you? You really would. Wolfgang, thank you so much. Your book it's on sale, is it, on Amazon, but also in a local gallery?
Yes, the new Elementum Gallery in South Street in Sherborne has a special promotion at the moment. If you buy one of the books there, they'll give you a giant wall poster, either for the kids or for your school or whatever. So that's quite unique, and that's available right now.
Lovely. Well, thank you so much for coming and talking to us.
Thanks, Jenny.
It's a wonderful book. Thank you. Thanks. So Wolfgang Grulke's book, Beyond Extinction, The Eternal Ocean, is out now, and I really recommend it. It's just lovely, and it is not pessimistic at all. In fact, I found it just the contrary.